viewers. Just a few days ago, had a very interesting discussion with some people that I met for the first time. And the discussion led to a talk about Judaism, a talk about the Torah of the nation of Israel. And those people told me they had a sense of being estranged, a sense of distance from the Torah of the nation of Israel. And of course, I asked them, why do you feel so estranged? Why do you feel so distant? And then we got into the discussion where it was clear to me that their understanding was the following. They apparently understood that the Torah of the nation of Israel is just a book of commandments, a compilation of laws. And for them, it was really hard for them. And I sensed that perhaps they have a sense of ignorance, a lack of understanding. And I wanted to share with you, the audience, what I shared with them. I asked them the following question. Is it truly a book of laws only? A compilation of all these commandments? Or perhaps, is there something first and foremost? There are principles that lie before the compilation of mitzvot, of these commandments. And I suggested, and I want to do with you together, let's take a glimpse together. Let's open up our Tanakh, our Chumash, what we generally call the Bible, the 5 books of Moses. And here, I started turning the pages. I let my fingers do the walking. I opened up the first book, what we commonly call Genesis, in Hebrew, Bereshit. And do you know that in the entire book, this first book of Bereshit, we have yet to come, we have yet to arrive to the nation of Israel. We have yet arrived to the place called Mount Sinai, where there was a great divine revelation. And there we received the Torah in mitzvot. And as we turned the pages and finished the first book, and we arrived to the second book, the book that we commonly call in Hebrew Shemot, names, or the nickname Exodus. And we're turning the pages and pages. After one book, and now in the second book, we arrive to chapter 12. Let me just share with you a little background. Chapter 12 of the book of Exodus. And here we find the first commandment that the Lord, our Almighty Lord of Israel, appears to the leaders of Israel, to Moses and Aaron, Moshe and Aaron. And there he commands the first commandment, the first entire commandment, after one entire book. And the beginning of the second book, we now arrive to the first commandment in the Torah. I'll tell you what it is. And there it says, and I'm quoting, HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim, rishon hu lachem lechodshei hashana. Basically, we're talking about here the Hebrew calendar. The nation of Israel is commanded to establish and set a Hebrew calendar, starting with this first month. Which first month? The month of the Exodus, which you may know is the Hebrew month of Nisan. To tell you the truth, that's not really our topic here. What I want to show to you and share with you is that the first commandment to a nation only appears after an entire book is completed. Remember, Bereshit, Genesis. And only in chapter 12 of the second book, Exodus, Shemot, do we find the first commandment. So what do you think? What do you think? Is this really a book of just commandments? a book of laws. We went through an entire first of the 5 books, and we have no commandment that applies to the nation of Israel yet. Do you know where I studied this idea? Let me share it with you. One of our greatest educators in all of Jewish history, his name was Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. If we take the 3 first letters in an acronym in Hebrew, Resh, Shin, and Yud, what do we get? Rashi. Yes. Resh, Rabbi, Shin, Shlomo, Yitzchaki, Yud. He lived in the 11th century in northern France. He was one of the primary and top educators of the Jewish people. Tremendous scholar. What he was able to absorb and understand and explain in such a concise way, the greatest and greatest of scholars with the usages of computers cannot even do. And he is our main educator and commentator on these 5 books. When we open up and study in the first book, and let me quote to you the first verse of the entire 5 books. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Rashi opens up with a fantastic rhetorical question. And Rashi asks the following: why didn't the Torah start with the first commandment to the nation of Israel? Namely, what we said just a moment before. Do you remember? HaChodesh hazeh lachem, the commandment of the establishment of the Hebrew calendar. Why didn't the Torah start with that? And here, Rashi is giving us a wonderful educational idea. Exactly what my friends thought beforehand. Isn't the Torah just a book of commandments? Isn't it just a compilation of laws? And here we see that it's not so. The Torah doesn't start off with the first national commandment. Rather, what does it start off with? A divine existence. And of course, that divine entity can do whatever he wants to do because it's his world. And in the words of one of our greatest authors, one of our greatest prophets and scholars, King David, he put together one of the most wonderful works, the book of Tehillim, Psalms. And there he writes in chapter 111, let me just make sure I have it right. Yes, in chapter 111, Koach ma'asav higid la'amo. What does that mean? God declares in his world his powers, his works. What does that mean? And what does that mean for us today? There's a divine creator. There's a divine order. What he does has a lot of importance. If he chooses to allocate lands to a particular nation or group of nations for a certain period of time, that's what he does. And when he decides that it's time to allocate those same lands and present it as a gift to someone else, that too he does. Namely, what the Torah is opening up with is the following. There's a divine order in the world. Things do not begin from the human intellect. There are divine principles. There are divine values. There's divinity in the world. What does it mean for us? Let's just look back a little in history. Let's go back a little more than 3,500 years. Remember? Prior to the giving of the Torah? The land of Israel. Do you know what it's called inside our holy book, inside the Chumash, inside the Torah? It's called Eretz Canaan, the land of Canaan. Psh, isn't that a little unusual? The land of Canaan? Why isn't it called the land of Israel? Perhaps you know that we have yet to come into the land. We have yet to inherit the land. So why is it called the land of Canaan? Because there are nations that are called Canaanite nations that have been living here ever since the time of the flood. Canaanite nations have been developing and growing and living here inside this land. The land between the Jordan River in the east and the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No, the Canaanites are not the founders of what later becomes the nation of Israel. If you remember, the Canaanites stem from Ham. Who was Ham? He was one of 3 children of Noach. Noach had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Yefet. Of the 3, do you know who was cursed? Yeah, that's right. It was Ham. And presently, in those generations, God allowed for Ham and the nations that developed from Ham to live in this very special land that we'll talk about in a moment. The land of Canaan, it's called. However, later on, the nation of Israel at Sinai, and even before Sinai, their divine connection about a place to live is not London and not New York, but only this land of Canaan. And in fact, the land of Canaan, not only is it promised and commanded to the nation of Israel at Sinai, but hundreds of years earlier, when we meet up with the founders of the nation of Israel, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, each of them are living in the land of Canaan. No, not as a nation. There are Canaanite tribes all over and around them, surrounded by them. Yet they're living here because they're summoned. They're commanded to live here because there's a deep connection between the land and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Where does this connection start from? It doesn't even start from Abraham living here. Certainly not afterwards from Isaac and Jacob. It starts from an earlier and earlier time. And that's the first principle of what the Torah is coming to teach the nation of Israel. The Torah is not just a book of commandments or a compilation of mitzvot. The Torah is coming to enlighten us in its first principle, according to what Rashi is explaining, that there's a divine entity in the world. And that entity gave an allowance of property, of real estate, of a land to the nation of Canaan, or the Canaanite nations. However, it's not going to be forever. The same God that allowed them to live here is saying to us, I'm the boss. That land is earmarked for a very special nation that will appear on the scene only hundreds of years later. And of course, you know what the name of that nation is. Yisrael, the nation of Israel. Israel is Jacob. That nation will appear on the scene only hundreds of years later. And their connection to that land is that since they are a divine nation, they were given a divine gift. The gift of the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. It was set aside. It was earmarked for the nation of Israel already from the time of creation. Remember, Bereshit bara Elohim Et hashamayim v'et haaretz. And it was God that created heaven and earth. And we're told that already in the beginning of creation. Not the first commandment. We're told that there's a divine entity in the world. And we're learning about his powers, his actions. And one of his actions, as King David is saying, Koach ma'asav higid la'amo. The actions, his works, are the most important thing. And his works are being told to his nation. And what is he giving? Let's repeat the entire quote. God declared to his people his actions to present to them the inheritance of the nations. That's the end of the verse that we didn't mention beforehand. The inheritance of the nations is the land of Israel. And that's really the first principle that God is presenting to us in the beginning of the 5 books. Our grandfathers, our great-grandfathers, the early Zionists, when they began the long journey coming back to the land of Israel from Eastern and Western Europe, and they started to argue amongst themselves, what's really the purpose of our comeback to the land of Israel? There were some that said and argued, we need a political and economic shelter. Europe, of course, is not the homeland for a political and economic shelter. The land of Israel, Palestine, is. We need the land of Israel so that we can be secure, both politically and economically. And there were those that were arguing, we just need a shelter for security. So much anti-Semitism all over the world. And there were those that arguing, we just need a land to collect ourselves together and use our values, our culture, our language. We need a place to be collected together. All those arguments of the early Zionists, we understand where they're coming from. But there's even a more deeper truth. There's something that's beyond the realm of a political or economic shelter. There's something which is beyond a place of security, a bomb shelter. And what is it? There's a land that's already set aside for the nation of Israel from the time of creation. And that land was earmarked and made suitable for a very special nation. Maybe today we have so many fellow Jews, so many brothers all over the country that are just ignorant, don't understand what's the depth of our land. And therefore they argue these type of political arguments, security arguments, economic arguments, why we have to hold on to the land. And if we can hold on to a smaller portion of the land and be more politically solvent or security solvent, maybe we can give up parts of this land and parts of that land, because the most important principle is to be politically secure, economically secure. But if we go back to the source, the roots of where we come from, who we really are, and where does the land come from, and understand that this is really a divine land. The land was earmarked and set aside from God from the time of creation, that it was meant for a nation of Israel, and that this land is hugged, as one of the great teachers of the land of Israel, Rabbi Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, he states that this land is hugged with inner talents, with inner treasures, deep things that the eye doesn't see, nor does the hand can sense or feel. These are things that we have to intellectually study. Namely, this land requires a lot of explanation. This land requires a lot of depth and understanding. And maybe in our lesson today, in our discussion today, we've begun to touch upon that the land of Israel is far beyond a solution that is something economic or a political solution or a safety solution. It's something beyond that. It's something beyond that the human intellect has to investigate and understand. And when we begin to understand how vast the treasure of this land is, how deep it is, then we'll begin to understand the importance of this land and its great importance to the nation of Israel. Have a nice day.